coming up on this episode of the Roundtable.
I just heard a presentation about welfare programs and income control. There are dozens. I mean, it is just out of control. Well, I am sure that, supports for education are out of control too. And harnessing that money to place conditions on it. I mean, can you imagine telling school districts, you don't get any federal money if you accept an education degree as qualifying your teachers? No more elementary education majors, no more ed school masters, 4-year college degree in a substantive area. And here's the list of areas that you can major in, right? Yep. And then we're going to do a teacher test. Now, the minute you do a test, you're going to have a disparate impact. So you've got to tame the DEI monster. So we've got this obsession with diversity of the teacher corps. Diverse teachers make better teachers. None of this has been proven. There's zero evidence for any of this. In fact, evidence to the contrary, because to get a more diverse teacher corps, you actually have to dumb down the teacher corps. And there is evidence that smarter teachers are more effective. I tell people that and they're shocked. You can't say that.
Hello and welcome once again to the Roundtable, your weekly publishers and editors podcast here at the American Mind. I'm your host, Spencer Clavin, associate editor of the Claremont Review of Books and mystery editor, wildcard editor of the American Mind. And this week I am joined by a special guest. We have a return performance from Professor Amy Wax. She's a professor of law at the University of Pennsylvania, still, despite a relentless campaign to get her canceled in every way known to man. She's had her pay docked. She's had her summer research funding suspended. She's been suspended for a year. All sorts, any kind of smear campaign you can imagine against Professor Wax. It's been waged. Nevertheless, she persisted. Here she is, still professor of law and second-time guest on the American Mind. Amy, welcome back.
Thank you very much. I'm glad to be here.
We're very glad to have you. The occasion for this discussion is that you had a bone to pick with us a couple of weeks ago when Trump won, and we were talking about first 100 days of the administration. What should the priorities be? We mentioned a bunch of things. I think I talked a lot about culture and some of the sort of more soft power aspects of the first Trump administration. But you wrote in quite rightly and said, nobody, not Mike, not Ryan, not Spencer, nobody mentioned the Department of Education, which needs a total systems overhaul. Would you like to introduce this proposal to us just to start off with? Where are we at with the Department of Education and what needs doing?
Right. Well, a bone to pick is a little strong. I'm a great fan of your podcast. And I generally agree with so much of it. But in this one case, what should be the first 100-day priorities? I thought, it's so typical that this incredibly vital issue is not being highlighted. And why is it an incredibly vital issue? I really just want to start with that. I don't think the Republican Party and the conservative movement in any of its forms has any future if we don't radically overhaul the education system. And here I am talking about K through 12 on up through higher ed, graduate education, professional education, every aspect of the university system. And why do I say that? Because what is going on right now is that impressionable young minds are being hammered by a far left identity obsessed social justice ideology under the guise of education. And that is happening. Well, is it happening everywhere? 24/7? Not quite, but it is certainly happening in a lot of places, and people aren't even really aware of it, right? So why does this matter? Eric Kaufman, the British sociologist, has shown that students that are exposed to critical race theory, to gender fluidity ideology, to negative commentary on our history, on our founding, and all this kind of woke stuff that, we're inherently ineradicably racist. I could go on and on. The standard issue woke ideology, they are swayed, they are influenced in their own thinking. And there's evidence for that. And they also become much more down on First Amendment rights. They are in censorship, cancellation, and all of that bad stuff. So it really does matter. Now, I recognize that with Trump's election, we have a bit of a rebellion by young men. Men have moved right, and it's mostly working class men. That is gratifying, but that still doesn't solve the problem, which is that young people are much more woke than older people. That's been measured and that's been verified. So really, this is something that has to be addressed and reversed. So I call my little shtick here radical reactionary. Why is that? Well, the radical part. I think that drastic action is in order. I think we need some really zealous proponents of it in order to get this stuff done, because it really is going to rub a lot of people the wrong way, and there is going to be tremendous resistance. Why do I call it reactionary? Because we don't have to reinvent the wheel here, Spencer. We have a guide to what education should look like, and that guide is the past. We only need to look back. And I specifically recommend that we look back to my hometown, Troy, New York, upstate New York, where I started kindergarten in 1957 and graduated from high school in 1971. So I was educated mostly in the 60s. And of course, it was upstate New York. It was a backwater. The 60s hadn't really arrived. Our model of education was really something out of the past. So what was that model? First of all, what were the main ideas that motivated the model? Well, the most important one, there were two, actually. One is that adults and children are radically different, right? Adults are the ones in authority. Children really are not equipped to make the kinds of decisions and judgments that we now delegate to them, to exercise their autonomy or choices of what to learn, think, and do, right? And people just accepted that. The second was that they thought about the schools as having a much more restricted ambit of authority than they do now in terms of what they taught, what they covered, what sorts of subjects were addressed, the role of teachers. They delegated to parents a far greater degree of authority in many areas. So much smaller footprint, much more modest footprint here, right? The third thing is the goals of K through 12 were perceived to be primarily conservative. Well, what do I mean by that? To transmit the knowledge and wisdom of past generations. And here I'm channeling Heather McDonald a bit, right? To preserve, protect, and defend our existing society, our Western advanced society, to venerate it, to see all its positives. All of that stuff was seen to be central to what the schools were supposed to do, on top of giving us the tools and knowledge to function as adults and citizens. And because there's a scarcity of time and resources, a lot of things had to be left out. Now, what had to be left out? Let's talk about sex. In my schools, there was zero sex education. And I mean zero. The whole topic was entirely absent. In fact, it was verboten. And no
How
one
did you learn about gender fluidity?
Well,
did you grow up with
I
no
didn't.
knowledge of the binary
I didn't.
spectrum?
I was blessedly ignorant of gender fluidity. In fact, I was blessedly ignorant of things like how babies were made. I think I found out how babies were made at the age of 14 from my friend Bonnie Szymanski. I do remember that moment. But anyway, no one questioned the state of affairs, and no one had to be instructed to maintain a decorous silence, right? And why was that? It's ironic because back then there was a lot more consensus about these topics than there is now, but there was still thought to be too much variation in people's approach for the schools to wade into this territory. And it was understood that there's no neutral, value free way to approach sex, right? This is inherently moralized, as it has been in every civilized society known to man, right? And teachers also agreed that parents are entitled to try to pass on their values, right? Even though they may not succeed. Well, we understand that, right? Now, today, there's even less consensus on sex and gender, but that only strengthens the argument for standing down, right? So, what do I mean by standing down? No biology, no anatomy, very, very little, as little as possible, right? I think we learned about menstruation, and maybe that was it. So nothing on gender fluidity, queerness, sexual practices, homosexuality, transgenderism, blah, blah, blah. When children ask about that, they should get the answer they got in 1962 in my school. Ask your parents, right? Now, relatedly, that may strike some people as radical, but it actually worked very well. Now, relatedly, it's, I think, simply conceptual confusion to label banishing explicit materials and subjects from libraries, let's say, or classrooms as censorship or book banning. These are just lefty propaganda terms. They are egregious misnomers. They do not reflect reality in any way, right? First of all, school authorities have plenary power to do this, right? And teachers and other personnel have no First Amendment rights. Actually, even lefties agree with this. I was very struck that Luke Menand, who's a sort of classical liberal professor at Harvard with, I think, progressive sympathies, he said in a New Yorker article something to that effect, K through 12, no First Amendment rights, really. Why? Teachers are there to be the mouthpieces for what the authorities tell them they can say and what they can't say. All right. So that's not censorship. The second thing is any parent can go to a public library or go online and buy whatever they want and then read it to their kids every night. They can teach them about masturbation or how to put on a condom or whatever it is they think their kids need to know. They just don't have the right to expose other people's children to this stuff. Right? So, got to get that, wrap your mind around that. Expose your own children. Don't expose other people's children. That's parental prerogatives. And that ought to be uncontroversial.
Yes, I remember as a youth when we would gather around and bedtime stories about masturbation and condom. No, this is a joke, by the way. That did not happen in the Clavin household, and probably shouldn't happen in an 80s household. But okay, sorry, I interrupted you. Go on.
Well, no, it didn't happen in my household either. But once again, we don't have the power or the prerogative to go into other people's households, and if they want to read Portnoy's complaint to their kids, or Miller, whatever the hell his name is, I forget, Tropic of Capricorn, Tropic of Cancer, the kind of books that my parents hid way, way, way in the back of the bookshelf, even though, of course, we found them. So that's their business. Now, I can
Henry
see
Miller. Sorry, it's
Henry. How could we forget Henry?
Oh, Henry.
Oh, Henry. Now, I can see that things get a bit more complicated when it comes to the hot topics of identity and race, efforts to banish critical race theory, et cetera, et cetera. So, it is not really feasible for schools to completely exclude these topics. They're part of history. But I think what we need far more of is, very simple word, balance, an even-handed historical presentation, right? And one that, by the way, avoids current events, right? Current events now are front and center. Back when I was in Troy, New York public schools, we did almost no current events. If there was election, our teacher would spend 2 minutes explaining how elections work and then move on. Nothing was said about the candidates at all, right? So what do we put in its place? Well, the nuts and bolts of our Constitution, our institutions, our economic system, the founders, their ideas, stuff my students have never heard of. The fact that the founders did not think all men were created equal, that they wanted to protect property from the mob, what their preoccupations and concerns were. My students are blissfully ignorant of all of that. And instead, our teachers are trained to be obsessed with race-related topics, slavery, discrimination, Rosa Parks, Martin Luther King. That has to be there, but it certainly shouldn't be the focus. And here I'm going to channel Eric Kaufman, my favorite British sociologist again. He says, if you're going to talk about slavery, tell them about the slave trade in Africa, indigenous slavery on the West Coast, the genocide and imperialism of the Aztecs, the fact that the Indian tribes weren't very nice to each other, that all nations are built on stolen land. Let's give them the truth, reality, etc. And then finally, and this I feel very strongly about, there needs to be a lot of information. They need to hear a lot more about the glories of European, American, and Western civilization and all the achievements in every area you can think of that they benefit from today. And how is that information regarded today in the education system? I can tell you that information, that kind of teaching for appreciation and reverence is white supremacy. And it is not done, right? It is truly a verboten topic. Okay, so instead, I would have a mega shift into a more Eurocentric and Euro-respected curriculum. And once again, minimize the debating society element, right? Emphasize the primacy of cultural transmission. Why do I not think that, we should be debating in 6th grade the hot topics of the day? I mean, students just are not equipped. Look, adults are barely equipped to do this. They just don't have the knowledge, the background, the information, the analytical skills. It's perfectly nice to have an extracurricular debating society in high school. That's fine. But it absolutely should not be front and center. And here I'm really opposing a philosophy of people like Jonathan Zimmerman, who's a very high-profile professor at the Penn Ed School, who thinks that that's what education should be all about. All right. And for my final recommendation for K through 12, no social emotional learning, right? No delving into students' psyches, because teachers are not therapists and they can't do it well. And their efforts are inevitably contaminated by dubious partisanship that ends up undermining parental authority. Now, one big benefit of what I've just outlined, which comes straight out of Troy, New York, 1960, right, is that it leaves time for worthy subjects like not just spelling, grammar, geography, etc., but home economics, shop, the basics of household finance, the actual useful stuff that kids ought to know and kids need to know, right? So that's my K through 12 rant. I just want to say a little bit about higher ed, because that's what people seem to focus on, because, all of these sort of cultural gurus, they're very obsessed with their glorious college experience. Now, I think this is a much harder topic for a lot of reasons. Okay, well, first and foremost, we're dealing with education for adults by adults, and these people supposedly have the wherewithal and the freedom to make independent judgments, blah, blah, blah. Can they actually do it? Well, given their K through 12 education, not very well, right? But there it is. Secondly, although the states create and fund public universities, there are federal First Amendment limits on government dictating what university members can say and teach. And the same is true for private universities. So, something like DeSantis's Stop Woke Act, I think it's fine for K through 12, and I think it works. I think for higher ed, it's dubious, right? And I could talk a little more about that because I think there are other better ideas for dealing with higher ed. And of course, we have strong traditions of academic freedom, institutional self-governance, which are subject to huge abuses today, right? Because we have capture by the left of the universities, but I am not sure that it's a good idea to get rid of all of these traditions. That's something that conservatives should have their doubts about. But we're still stuck with this intractable problem, the lefty capture of our universities, right? And of course, the elites are getting indoctrinated. They're getting the propaganda. They're going to go out and shape our society. And this is a far bigger problem than, a very isolated attempts by red states such as Florida to control what happens in universities that the lefties wail about endlessly. This is like wailing about a splinter when you've got, metastatic cancer, really. So what can be done? I frankly think the best tool here is to use Title VI, to use the spending power as a lever to control what universities do. And that does mean more government control. I understand that, but it's very surgical and selective control because it depends on federal funding. Right? And remember, schools always have the option of rejecting federal funding. Now, will they do that? No, the big universities get hundreds of millions of dollars. This is what many people do not realize. And this is mainly in the form of student loans, but also grants for social science, for science, for medical schools. And off the top of those grants is skimmed 70%, 80% for overhead of the university. A little known fact that the universities don't want people to know. Okay. So how do we use the spending power? First, force the universities to adopt First Amendment speech protections. Now, the public universities already have that constraint, and they still cancel people, but you have to add a private right of action with very hefty remedies, right? You can do that by executive order, right? And the government fund should be conditioned on drastic reductions in university bureaucracies and the complete dismantling of offices of diversity, equity, and inclusion. And that includes accrediting agencies dropping their demand for diversity and equity. And the university should be mandated to adopt colorblind admissions and hiring, also with hefty private rights of action and remedies, right? On and on. Education schools should be defunded, ideally abolished, right? So government money should not go to education schools, and government money shouldn't go to K through 12 schools that accept an education degree for teachers. The education schools should be kneecapped and put out of business by mandates that teachers get a BA and take a test, right? Pass a test. So all of this stuff could be done with the lever of government money. Some of it could be done at K through 12. A lot of it could be done at the higher ed level. And frankly, if I were by some magic appointed the head of civil rights, now everybody thinks the ed school can do this, and there is a civil rights office in the ed school, but really it's the civil rights division of the Justice Department that is in charge of enforcing Title VI, right? And getting rid of all the discriminatory practices that the universities engage in every day in every way, and very egregiously and proudly, I would walk in the first day and tell my staff, no more federal money for the top 20 universities, and they need to prove to us that they are colorblind in order to get it back, right? And let the whales go up. But frankly, if you step back, here's the logic of it. If these schools value diversity and they want to make race-based decisions and they have an idea of what a great university looks like, hey, they can use their own money to do it. They aren't entitled to tax truck drivers and store clerks so that Harvard can engage in their luxury beliefs. That's just not right. They're very rich. They're very wealthy. They can also, fund their own students. They don't need federal loans. They can put their money where their mouth is. So, that sounds drastic, but it's really quite simple.
So this topic is really funny to me because for years, every time I'm engaged in a big structural, where did we go wrong kind of conversation with anybody on the right, in the last 5 minutes or so of our allotted time, we end up saying something like, and this is why education is just really important. And we should have a whole other conversation about that and how to overhaul it. And then we never do. It's one of those things that you leave to the end. It's the conclusion of every diagnosis and probably ought to be the starting point of every diagnosis. So thanks for getting us started. It's a classical philosophical position that education is political, that it shapes the kinds of citizens you're going to end up with, and that it's never neutral from day one, from the word go.
Exactly, very much so. And of course, the Democrats have dedicated their whole party and philosophy to the notion that everything is partisan. So they should be fine with it.
They're very into this. And this is a major, those that are up on their Gramsci and their, Frankfurt School are well aware that this is a strategy. I think the K through 12 element is the element that gets shortest shrift because it's not sexy, with the one exception of the controversies that you alluded to over books in school libraries. Nobody really loves
and bathrooms.
Bathrooms. Thank you.
Bathrooms and the whole transgender thing.
Yeah.
Right. Well, so this is all
very high profile.
Right. That's all very high profile, very much in the news, but to me, it's symptomatic. It's not actually the main issue that we're talking about, which is like, do kids arrive in college knowing how to read? I mean, I'm hearing about students that are coming in freshman year and they've never read a full book in a sitting, cover to cover. And so there are of course, these two things are related, right? The time that's being spent analyzing the genderbread snow person or the gender whatever unicorn is not being spent hooked on phonics. And I'm wondering, is this a domain? You talked a lot about kind of local strategies that parents and schools can adopt. We've got this new federal administration coming in. We've had this huge red wave. And I want to get to what they can do about colleges in the second half of what you said. But I'm curious what you think the role is for the federal government in this somewhat more neglected area of, can we just teach the kids, please, how to read books and not how to parse, non-binary gender identities?
Yeah, well, I mean, one thing I didn't say, and it's an important piece of it, is not just that all this other nonsense is crowding out the basics of, reading and math and stuff, the basic skills, but how, the teachers' unions and, the progressive elites with their, narcissistic luxury beliefs are clinging to ineffective methods for teaching. So, for example, take phonics, right?
Replaced by the Common Core, right?
Well, right. I mean,
Yeah.
well, the problems with the Common Core are, I'll just park those for a moment. But my daughter has two little sons, and she was touring the local elementary school, which is, in a very fancy upscale neighborhood. And the principal said, well, we still teach whole language. And my daughter said, well, wait, why do you do that? It's been proven ineffective, and phonics is the way to go, especially, for kids with reading problems. And the principal said, well, it takes a long time to turn the ship. Well, that's bullshit. We don't want to change it. Why don't we want to change it? Ideology, herding cats, the vanity of teachers who see themselves as professionals who should have autonomy, and all of these cracked ideas that, are still abroad in this unholy alliance of the teachers union and the education schools. And the bottom line is, my daughter walked out of there and said, sorry, not for us. Have to find an alternative. But how many parents are really in that position? So here, I think there is a lot to be said about how there isn't a serious approach to teaching kids the basic, because that's considered unsexy and unromantic and unfun. The system is really about the teachers much more than the students. That's what it's kind of become in a way. Their ideas, their notions, their ideologies, and the like. So it's failing on that level. You would think parents would care about that. Unfortunately, where it really bites is the less fortunate students, the ones who are not from, upper class homes, where more or less the kids are going to learn to read anyway. The kids are going to learn math anyway, even though they're not memorizing their times tables. They're not memorizing the stuff that they need to know to really go forward in math. Once again, this stuff, it's all luxury beliefs. So there is that. So the federal role, I think one of the frustrations here with K through 12, one of the obstacles, is that most of it is done at the local level. And here I mean the state departments of education, which are really ground zero. The state departments of education need to get much, much more focus from the Republicans, from conservatives. They should be at the very top of the list. I mean, we have DeSantis, he and Youngkin. They're two people who know what time it is, but the rest of them, it's not a big deal. I mean, Trump gave a 5-minute speech about education. The zeal and the urgency, they're just not there. And then there are all school districts. Well, as Oscar Wilde said about democracy, it takes too many evenings. I mean, fighting the K through 12 battle,
right,
is a really, really tough business. And you lose a few and you gain a few. I mean, up in Pennsylvania, north of us, in this pretty lily white upscale school district, they brought back the transgender bathrooms last week. It's always a power struggle. So I don't have a magical solution to that, except more focus, more urgency, more understanding of, more effort, more personnel in this. What can the federal government do? Once again, as with higher ed, the federal government is funneling a lot of money into local schools. All right. I am not familiar, and I need to get familiar with all of these different programs. Oh my God, the proliferation of them. I just heard a presentation about welfare programs and income control. There are dozens. I mean, it is just out of control. Well, I am sure that, supports for education are out of control too. And harnessing that money to place conditions on it. I mean, can you imagine telling school districts, you don't get any federal money if you accept an education degree as qualifying your teachers? No more elementary education majors, no more ed school masters, 4-year college degree in a substantive area. And here's the list of areas that you can major in, right? Yep. And then we're going to do a teacher test. Now, the minute you do a test, going to have a disparate impact. So you've got to tame the DEI monster. So we've got this obsession with diversity of the teacher corps. Diverse teachers make better teachers. None of this has been proven. There's zero evidence for any of this. In fact, evidence to the contrary, because to get a more diverse teacher corps, you actually have to dumb down the teacher corps. And there is evidence that smarter teachers are more effective. I tell people that, and they're shocked. You can't say that.
Yeah.
So there's a lot of battles to fight here.
Right. Well, it's funny.
A lot of windmills to tilt at.
We should have maybe probably a lot of our listeners know this, but we should fill them in that, the phonics approach would be probably what you learned in school, sounding out letters and syllables.
Troy, New York, of course.
Yeah. And then whole language is this new, to your point, kind of cockamamie idea that was highly theoretical, that you're just going to place the way that kids learn to speak a language naturally. They're going to learn to read the same way. Total disaster. Don't have time to get into it, but truly, this is one of those failures for which, it's akin to the Afghanistan withdrawal, where if there were any justice in the world, everybody involved would be out of the job. But in fact, as you say, these have really stuck as ideas. And I wonder if there's a strategic maneuver that can be borrowed from the higher profile culture wars issues, where what really seemed to work with those is when parents started going to school board meetings and just putting the material on display, just saying, look, this is a book that's in the library. And then they were told many times not to read aloud from these books because they're smut and they're not appropriate for a gathering of adults, let alone for kids. And I wonder whether there's maneuvering to be done also in just putting forward the educational results of some of these basic, rudimentary theories, and just saying, college kids can't read a book. Is this actually what you want? And is there anybody of any political persuasion that thinks it's a good idea to persist in a theory that's been proven not to work?
Yeah, well, you would think, right, that when actually informed about this and exposed to it and the results, that it would make a real difference. There would be a rebellion, but unfortunately, there's a tremendous amount of sneakiness and lying and, just plain dishonesty out there in telling parents what's really going on. And of course, who's telling them? The teachers who either are not sophisticated enough to really evaluate this evidence, although they conceive it, in many places, kids aren't reading at all. But also, once again, this ideology that whole language is more sophisticated, it's more creative, it's more appealing. It's what, smart people embrace. That old stuff is just, it's old fashioned, it's out of date, it's obsolete. Progressives love everything new. They're, neoteric. It all fits in with this ideology that they embrace. Now, you would think that the Democrats and, the progressive types would be appalled that we have city after city after city where, close to 0% of the students are reading at grade level, leaving aside, the affluent suburbs where everybody's okay anyway. Well, vis-a-vis that, I recently listened to a presentation at the American Enterprise Institute by a guy named Jorge Elorza, who was a former mayor of Providence and who now works in education. And here's what he said about education reform. He said, the Democratic Party leadership today is simply indifferent. They are unconcerned that many inner city schools don't have students that, have basic skills. Why is that? Well, they're more interested in the woke ideology that regards tests and measures of achievement as a cover for oppression. So they just don't think about, they don't pay attention to these tests because they're busy, attacking them. They're busy undermining their bona fides. Right. And the teachers union and upper white middle class who control the party completely escape the consequences of these bad ideas. Right. So we've got this perverse situation in the Democratic Party now, which controls so many of these blue cities, so many of these school districts, where they've kind of given up on education reform. He obviously is upset and shocked by this because their ideology tells them that none of these measures mean anything. All right. They honestly believe that. Do they believe that in their own lives when they're trying to get little Caitlin into Princeton? No. They have this kind of schizoid approach that treats the city kids, the ordinary kids, the lower half of society as a different species somehow. I don't know.
Yeah, this makes me wonder, Amy, or it's sort of obvious, I guess, but part of the solution has to be some strategy for dealing with the teachers' unions and their outsized influence in politics. I mean, outlawing public employee unions again, get us back to the great days of JFK and FDR on the Democratic side, where the notion of public employee unions was considered absurd and extortionary of Republican principles. Maybe you can't get there. Maybe that's too pie in the sky, but at the very least, going after their dues, mandatory dues, and all the rest, because this is one of the huge levers of power that stands in the way of real educational reform.
Right. And actually, my lefty friends are very upset when I tell them that FDR himself called public unions an abomination.
Yeah, that's right.
They are an abomination. Okay. Yeah. It perverse from day one. And we are seeing the results with this teachers unions, which are a menace. I can't think of one positive effect that they have had. But I just don't know how to kneecap the teachers unions. It's very, very difficult.
Yeah. I want a question that's come up in recent days on the right, especially on the online right, but it's muted for now in the zeal that accompanies winning and the great call that has existed since the Reagan administration to abolish the Department of Education. I want to get your thoughts on that. I think with my friend Inez Stepman and others who've written on this, that would be a mistake. Maybe the eventual goal should be its abolishment, but in the meantime, it sounds like from your presentation, some very tight relationship between the lawyers and lieutenants of the Department of Education, the education secretary, along with the Civil Rights Division at DOJ, in working to remove all the really bad strings and extricate and prune all this NGO and mandate stuff from the Department of Education, while in the meantime, using those levers and that money to reform and also to empower localities would be the first few steps you take long before you would just get rid of the department.
Right. So I think, abolishing the Department of Education, which sounds good, is just another example of trying to use procedural measures to deal with a substantive problem. And I feel the same way about school choice and charter schools. I'm all for all that stuff. That's great. But, you have to recognize 95% of our students go to public schools. So unless you go inside the public schools and make changes, nothing will happen. So, what about the Department of Education? Well, to me, what really needs to be done first, just to have a department with all those personnel, all those bureaucrats, that's bad. So the aspiration of shrinking the government by consolidating and closing down, that in itself is a good thing. But what you really have to do is look inside the Department of Education and ask yourself, what are they doing? What are their programs? What are their functions? And how are their functions promoting all this bad stuff and all the racialization and all the kind of equity focus that's undermining learning and meritocracy? Those are the broader questions that the Trump people need to ask for the government as a whole. There are so many myriad areas where the government is prioritizing this stuff in every way, every day. And what programs is the Department of Education administering, and what are the sources of the programs? Some of them are mandated in law. it's feel good stuff that Congress has done. So you're not going to, even if you get rid of education, you're going to have to park them somewhere else. So take Pell Grants, low income grants, which are sort of out of control and are going, to all sorts of higher ed establishments that are, using race-based decision making, or even graduate schools, right? That's an area where, Congress has created that. I don't know. All we can do is purify it and make sure of it. It's not going to the wrong places that are engaged in the wrong policies. Title I money, K through 12, for low-income schools. That might be a very powerful lever for telling schools you don't get any of that Title I money unless you clean up your act in all sorts of different ways. So, I would rather look inside the box.
Yeah.
And see what they're doing. Now, you could close the department and farm some of this stuff out. Maybe some of it could just be abolished altogether. But you have to go case by case to see where it's coming from. If it's coming from Congress, then, you have to try and minimize its evil impact. If it's coming from the executive branch and regulation, it's a lot easier to shrink it or even get rid of it. So not knowing all the different stuff the Department of Education is doing, much of it, I am sure, truly awful. I really can't say whether shutting down the Department of Education will do any good. I think having fewer departments, having fewer people, all of that, I see that as a good thing. But the minute you say that, you have even people on the right, even Republicans saying, well, actually, there are parts of the government where we have too few people, not too many people, because this program needs more efficiency or whatever. My response, tell me more about the program. Do we really need this program?
Yeah.
So the Department of Ed had, so Ms. McMahon, I guess, who was just appointed, if I were her, if I could give her a brain transplant, I would go in there, and the first thing I would do, and she just doesn't strike me as someone who's going to be doing this, I would say to my personnel, my people who are working for me, I want a complete list. I want to be briefed in a very succinct way about everything this damn department is doing.
So you're not impressed with Linda McMahon?
Well, it's not that I'm not impressed with her, because I don't really know much about her, but my sense is that she is an establishment Republican type figure.
Yeah.
And not someone who has thought very deeply about what is ailing the education system, or, and this is vital because there are people like Rufo and DeSantis who do see this, the connection between what is happening in the education system and the threats to, the Republican Party, the conservative movement, a set of ideas and commitments that we absolutely need in our country to maintain its vitality, to maintain a vigorous right, a vigorous free market system, free thought system, everything that we associate with conservatism, respect for traditional values. I could go on and on. How all of those important priorities depend on the education system. And I just don't see her as someone who really gets that connection at all, because the Republicans are blind to it. I mean, the Republicans have so been asleep at the wheel on this, and as they have been on other issues. Once again, just got finished with a presentation at AEI on welfare programs, or not welfare, but just transfer programs, and how they discourage work and marriage. I mean, honestly, after you see this, you'll just shake your head in dismay. We have programs, which when you put them together, if you earn $6,000 more in your family, you will lose $18,000 in benefits. I mean, this routinely happens.
Yeah.
This seems peripheral, but it's relevant in the sense that this has been allowed to develop, and the Republicans are just standing by and letting it happen.
Yeah, I have to agree on McMahon, especially because she wanted to run the Commerce Department, and education was a kind of trade-off with the internecine fight about cabinet positions. So now you could solve that problem if you convinced her to hire a bunch of killers as lieutenants, lawyers, and all the rest who are really committed to this reform. So I don't want to write her off at all, but it's I hope there are smart minds within the transition thinking about the principal and deputy question and how you can. I mean, look, trade-offs have to be made in any. You've got to reward the people that helped you get to where you are, and cabinet positions that's part of that game always. So I don't mean to poo-poo the nomination too much, but I think you could solve that problem, and I hope they're thinking about it.
Yeah, well, it's fine. I'm fine with him rewarding, people that have supported him and all this, but you have to kind of do it in a shrewd way. And, even if she has, the sort of go for the jugular types right under her, and I've actually suggested some names, actually someone who would be fantastic and in a way unconventional, would be Andy Gutman, the Brearley dad, who, is smarter than most academics I know. And he would be terrific because he understands the problems. So that's just one example of someone who I think would be really proactive and great. And, there's Chris Rufo, and he has a whole bunch of people that he's associated with.
Amy, remind me, is Gutman the New York hedge fund guy who got fed up with woke schooling?
With
yeah.
Yeah, he wrote a letter to the headmaster, mistress of Brearley, because COVID, during COVID, he actually got to see what, his daughter was being taught, and he was pretty shocked at it, and in a very articulate way, took it down. And of course, was essentially told by the head of school that he and his daughter's presence would not be missed. So got effectively kicked out of there because most of the parents were okay with it, Anyway, there are some creative things that could be done. I just am not sure that, she's willing to be as radical as she needs to be. This ties into a broader issue here with the Trump administration and some of the people that are being appointed. Once again, I don't claim to know a huge amount about them. But for someone like Gates, for example, I'm really of two minds. And students asked me about this. So we had a session with a group of the undergraduate Republican Party. I mean, on the one hand, he doesn't obviously have the gravitas that we associate with an attorney general and the experience. And he's a bit of a fringy character in his persona. But on the other hand, and we want that office to have respect. But on the other hand, I mean, the clowns that they bring in, people like Merrick Garland, like, what have they done for us lately, right? I mean, he has a million credentials. You want someone to come in who's just going to upset the whole apple cart, because the whole thing is rotten to the core on some level.
Yeah. Well, the premise is always that this is a respectable, decorous institution that has always behaved so generously. And now Trump and his disruptive, mean cabinet is coming in to upend the entire situation. But of course, this is all a total fantasy. Many of these institutions are already captured by absurd, corrupt, and unpleasant people. And I, for my part, find some of the people that Trump has put on the stand not all that thrilling characterologically, but it's not like I'm wringing my hands over the loss of some grand American decorum when, that is all a confection of the left. I think we're agreed. Um, yeah, I am. Well, I guess we'll just have to see. Like it seems like this is one of those areas where there are a lot of there's sort of a deep bench on the right. There's a lot of talent here, a lot of people invested in this with a lot of interest, and it's odd to me that Trump, who in general has been really good about staffing up, doesn't seem all that keyed into this, but maybe it's just a symptom of the larger problem that you're indicating about Republicans.
No, I think it is a weakness of Trump that, he's easily distractible and, a little bit scattershot. And I don't agree with, his priorities. I mean, I agree with much of what he's trying to do, but I don't agree with his priorities. And also, in a way, yeah, he's not as resolute and as radical, quote unquote, as I would like him to be. I mean, just on the topic of immigration, for example, the only worthwhile thing that I've read in the New York Times in the past month was Orrin Cass saying that it's time for E-Verify, and there will be whales of protest from the right as well as from the left. I don't know if Trump has the guts and the gumption to introduce that technological shock, because it will be. It absolutely will be. I mean, we have this perverse system now where, and once again, this going to this welfare program reminded me of it, where we throw tens of thousands of dollars at low skilled people. So, of course, they're not going to work. They're going to be jobs that Americans won't do. Why should they do them? And we tell ourselves, well, we get these jobs done. Illegals are doing a lot of these jobs, whether we like it or not. And Americans get to stand down. So all of these perverse systems work together, and I just don't see Trump kind of standing back. His instincts are good, but standing back and sort of identifying where all the perversities are and, being willing to act against them. Right. And I mean, the same is true in the education field as well. Same set of problems. There are people out there, I think, who would be great. Getting them, in and getting them to work together is very difficult. And then you have to win the hearts and minds of the population, the educated, so-called educated population, and also the female side of it are so captured by these bad ideas. And it's one thing to have decorum and gravitas and a million, top degrees behind your name. But if you actually open the hood and look at the content of some of these ideas, or how, let's say, the Justice Department is applying the law, it is so appalling. The way Title IX is administered, as kangaroo courts. The Biden administration has brought that back. The way transgenderism is treated by, the likes of the Solicitor General, who gets in front of the Supreme Court and tells us there's no good evidence that standing down on transgender surgery, does any good. Well, that's a lie, right? But ideology trumps truth there. So we have our decorous people pushing incredibly destructive, wrong-headed policies. So that just makes you think, who gives a shit about decor? Excuse my language.
No, I mean, speaking of, right? Speaking of, no, it's yeah, no, I mean, this is going to sound like a bit of a humble brag, but I frequently have this weird experience where I'll go on a conservative news show, and the host will turn from delivering a blistering rant about our elites and how corrupt they are, with every word of which I agree, by the way, that this is a totally decrepit class that has sinned away its day of grace. And then they'll turn and be like, my guest today is Spencer Klavan. He's got degrees from Yale and Oxford, so he's brilliant. You think that's, you don't want to interrupt the interview, but remember to say that's exactly the wrong idea. Like this, we still are kind of addicted to this way of thinking, I think, even when we acknowledge the problem.
brilliant but bad ideas, right? I mean, it reminds me of what a Yale law professor, now, antediluvian and probably on his way out, said about a colleague of mine at a prior law school. He says, she has lots of ideas. All of them are bad. And
a prolific author of terrible
full of ideas. Everyone is bad.
Yeah.
So I think, with our leadership class, we can maybe say something quite similar. And it's a shame because I do believe in the meritocracy. I do believe some people are smarter than others. I do believe that, competence is important. And all of that is still very true. And there are sectors in our society where those principles have bite, they matter. And they are keeping us afloat in our very, very complex technological society. I have, relatives who are in academic medicine, people who, really are very, very skilled at what they do, know a tremendous amount, very well trained. They're going about their business every day in ways that benefit all of us. So, we have to preserve and protect all of that. And we're not. That's a whole nother story. But for now, our elites, there are segments of our elites who are very useful and are very important. And that's, we have to winnow out the good parts from the bad parts, I'm afraid. Yeah. So one of my concerns and one of my fears, and this is pertinent to the rot in our education system, is the wholesale assault on the very idea of merit and the meritocracy. Of course, this is all motivated by obsessions with equity and the fact that we have this intractable problem that continues to plague us, which is group differences in achievement and group differences in proficiency. And the education system is constantly trying to deal with it often in very destructive ways. And one of the destructive ways is, as Alorza alluded to at this AEI conference, by just throwing up your hands and saying, oh, they do badly on the test, but what do the tests mean? Who cares about the test? That's one way of getting out from under the problem of failing to educate a good segment of the population.
Is waving your hands about, well, what's really all of this about? Well, we have to wrap up here. Amy, this was such a pleasure. Thank you for joining us. You have many ideas. Many of them are good, in fact, and we're very glad to have you here. One more time, Amy Wax is professor of law at the University of Pennsylvania. Thanks for joining us.
Well, thank you. And I'm very proud that you don't think that all of my ideas are bad.
But I won't tell you which ones. I'll only tell 95%. 9 out of 10 doctors agree. Thank you all for listening to the Roundtable. If you want to know more about our work, you can visit our websites at americanmind.org, ClaremontReviewOfBooks.com, and our DC-based Center for the American Way of Life at dc.claremont.org. If you like the show, go ahead and rate it 5 stars, drop it in the group chat, share it around. If you don't like the show, you can keep your bad opinions to yourself. Those are one of the bad ideas that you have if you have criticisms of the American mind. Just keep them in private. Thanks to our production and engineering crew, the brothers G, Jake and Ryan Gannon, and thanks to you all for listening. We will talk to you next.
Bye.